Welcome to the Frontier Culture Museum and our final lecture for our Lord Dunmore's War Weekend event. My name is Paige Hildebrand. I'm the Director of Events here. And before we get started with the lecture, I wanted to say a big thank you to the American Frontier Culture Foundation, who has made this program and many other programs that we do throughout the year possible. This includes things like scholarship for our summer camps, as well as field trip grants, so school kids can come and experience history in person. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our last speaker, Dr. Glenn Williams, who's presenting on Dunmore's War, the last conflict of America's colonial era.
Well, thank you, Paige, for that introduction. First of all, I want to say sorry I cannot be there in person. I haven't perfected bilocation yet. And I was also committed to leading what the military calls a staff ride, a training exercise for military leaders on the Saratoga battlefield. So that's where I'm calling from right now. So I was a little overbooked, but I'm glad you are all here, and I hope you enjoy the lecture. And this is, of course, one of my favorite topics, Dunmore's War, the last Indian conflict of America's colonial era. It's really, really appropriate that you are where you are at Stanton. Stanton, of course, then was the county seat of Augusta County, which plays a big part in Lord Dunmore's War. And it was the area that the Augusta County militia mustered in when they were getting ready to go on the expedition. So let's just cover a little background about what's going on in the colonies at the time. We've all heard about the Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued in October of that year, after the end of the 7 Years' War, or what we in the colonies call the French and Indian War. And the proclamation, most of you probably are aware, did several things. One, it said that there would be some new colonies. The province of Quebec. Quebec at the time is not just current Canada, or it's not current Canada. It is the current province of Quebec in Canada, plus the modern states, or the U.S. states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The proclamation also added the colonies of East and West Florida, which had been Spanish before the 7 Years' War, and the island of Grenada in the West Indies, which had also been Spanish before the 7 Years' War. But what we all remember about the proclamation is that it drew an arbitrary line from the headwaters of all the waters that flowed to the Mississippi. And then from that line west, that land was reserved to the Indians as their hunting ground. And there wasn't supposed to be any settlement west of that line. Also, in the proclamation, it also included the phrase, until our future pleasure be known. So Virginians particularly saw this as a temporary measure, and they were pushing to move the line of settlement to the west. The proclamation also said that further cessions of Indian land had to be done as part of a treaty and had to be officiated by a representative of the British Crown. They could no longer be private purchases of Indian land. So all this went into the proclamation of 1763. Two main Indian polities that we're going to be dealing with. The colonies were divided into two departments, North and South. The superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Northern Department, Sir William Johnson, most of his time was spent with the Six Nations of Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee. They are the most powerful Indian polity on North America, and the ones we'll be talking about a lot. The other that we'll be talking about a lot in the Southern Department, the Cherokee, the Southern Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Colonel John Stewart, would be dealing mostly with the Cherokee. So that plays into a lot of this as well. And first, we ought to mention, too, that by Virginia's royal charter, the land granted to Virginia, that didn't mean it was automatically part of Virginia. It was kind of like the right of first refusal. The land that was available to Virginia to expand into, providing Indian nations ceded it, included everything from the coast of Virginia west to include not only the current states of Virginia and West Virginia and parts of Kentucky, but also the current states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So what does that sound like? The new province of Quebec. So how did things change? It was almost immediately realized that the proclamation of 1763 was almost obsolete before the ink was dry. There were already thousands of settlers west of that proclamation line. So the lords of the board of trade in Great Britain sent word through the colonial secretary to renegotiate the line of settlement for the ground that was open to westward expansion of the colonies. So the proclamation was meant all along as a way to manage westward expansion. So Sir William Johnson, Superintendent of Indian Affairs in the North, holds the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768 with the Six Nations of Iroquois. Now, keep in mind that the Six Nations considered themselves the lords of the area. They were an empire. Their empire stretched from what we think of as the Finger Lakes today, down along the Susquehanna, and then west to the Mississippi, and along, or west to the Ohio, I should say, and along the Ohio. And they considered the Indian nations that lived there, the Delaware, and some of the others, as their as under their dominion, okay, under part of their empire. During the 17th century, they also swept down the Ohio Valley and drove out the Shawnees. The Shawnees lived in the Ohio Valley as well, and they were driven out and broke into 4 different septs, similar to clans and other Indian nations, and went in different directions. Some went north and settled in the Susquehanna Valley for a while. Some went west towards the Mississippi. Some went south to the Suwannee River. A lot of people think that the word Suwannee comes from Shawnee because one of the septs settled in that area. And just before the French and Indian War, the Shawnees come back into the area and ask the Six Nations to be able to settle in the Ohio Valley again on the North Bank. The Six Nations pretty much tell them, you can do that, but you will remain under our dominion. And if you've ever read Conrad Weiser's explanation of Indian politics, he says after that for which the Shawnees mortally hated them. Now, further, what the Treaty of Fort Stanwix did was the Six Nations ceded everything along the Susquehanna River, south to the west branch of the Susquehanna, along the west branch of the Susquehanna and the Juniata, all the way to the Allegheny, down the Allegheny till it turns into the Ohio at the forks of the Ohio, where Pittsburgh is, along the Ohio all the way to the mouth of the Tennessee River. Everything south of that was ceded to Great Britain. And the biggest beneficiary of that, of course, was Virginia. Now, there was a conflicting claim there as well. The Cherokees were also in the area, so Colonel John Stewart is directed to also initiate a treaty. And the first one is the Treaty of Hard Labor Creek, 1768, where the Cherokee gives some of that area that belonged to them west of that proclamation line up. And then this wasn't quite far enough for both parties. It was not really a good, recognizable terrain feature of a boundary. Indians didn't think it was very much good for anything. The Virginians wanted to expand west. So that's followed by the Treaty of Loch Harbor in 1770. And then one more time, again, it's not a very good boundary. The Cherokees agreed to what was called the Cherokee Grant in 1771, officiated by Alexander Cameron. That's Stewart's deputy for the Cherokee, to where they move the line of settlement open to the Louisa or Kentucky River in present-day Kentucky. And at the same time, there was a group of businessmen in London and Philadelphia that wanted to start a 14th inland colony that was going to be called Vandalia. It would take up a lot of what is present West Virginia. And who do you think this is going to rub the wrong way? It's going to be the Virginians, because the land they would have taken for Vandalia would have been part of Virginia. So this gives you a background of the different things going on with the settlement and the westward expansion of Virginia. Now, let's talk a little bit about Governor Dunmore. Sir John Murray, the fourth Earl of Dunmore. He was veteran of the 7 Years' War. He leaves the army in 1761 to enter politics. I'm sure you've seen this portrait of him before. You see it a lot if you go to Colonial Williamsburg. It is not his military uniform. As those of you who are familiar with military uniforms will know. We would call this a campaign poster, because in 1761 he stood for election as a representative peer of Scotland for a seat in the House of Lords of the British Parliament. All that aside, as royal governor of Virginia, he had several powers and authorities, either through his commission and his appointment or his letter of instruction, that allowed him to appoint officers in the militia. All officers in the militia had a commission signed by Dunmore. Does that mean he personally appointed every one of them? No, not necessarily. Along with his colonial council, he would appoint directly the field officers, the colonels, the majors, the lieutenant colonels. And then from there, they would go on to the other officers. He had the power, the authority to raise regiments of provincial regulars, full-time soldiers, if he wanted to. He could march them anywhere in the province, either militia or the regulars. He could draft men. Okay? We usually talk about people joining the militia. Well, yeah, either in the provincial service or the militia, people could be drafted for military service. And he could oppress equipment and provisions and supplies and boats and other things if he felt it was necessary for the defense of his colonies. But he left most of the administrative and training duties of the militia to what were called the county lieutenants. And we'll talk more about them in a few minutes. The governor held the power of the sword, and his duties including what it has on the slide. He could arm, muster, and command all persons in the colony. His main purpose was to defend the colony from invasions from without, suppress rebellions internal, pursue enemies out of the province. He could not cross into another colony, by the way. He could establish and erect fortifications. He could proclaim martial law during wartime. And during wartime, he could issue letters of marque and reprisal. This is the commissioning of privateers during wartime. Now, Governor Dunmore, like all royal governors, held the power of the sword. Like I said, he could do all those things, raise regiments of provincial regulars, call out the militia, etc. But he did not hold the power of the purse that belonged to the colonial legislatures, the General Assembly of the colony of Virginia. You may know that the General Assembly had two houses, an upper and a lower house. The appointed upper house, the council, kind of sat in equal to the House of Lords in Parliament, whereas the governor was the king's viceroy. And then the lower house, the House of Burgesses, was the elected house. And just like the lower house in our Congress, the House of Representatives, or the current Parliament, the House of Commons, even then the House of Commons, any bills that had to do with raising money, the power of the purse had to start in that lower house. So Virginia, the House of Burgesses. They also wrote the militia law. The militia law expressed how the militia could be organized, its regulations, how the men could be disciplined. During wartime, they could pass laws for treating deserters or mutinies. They could make another one of the laws that went along with the militia law was the Act for Making Provisions Against Invasions and Insurrections. This told how the militia could be used in operations, not just administratively. And most of all, most important of all, whether it be provincial regulars or the militia, it was the House of Burgesses that had to pass the acts of revenue to raise the taxes to pay for any military activity. Now let's talk about the county lieutenants for a little while. Don't know if you can see the commission that I have pictured there, but it is from Dunmore's predecessor, Governor Boditot. And it is a commission for a Colonel Thomas Jefferson. I think a lot of people don't realize Thomas Jefferson held a military rank. He was the commander-in-chief of the militia of Albemarle County, Virginia, in the colonial era. Now, the officer you see pictured there is Colonel Charles Lewis. Colonel Charles Lewis is the county lieutenant of Augusta County, the county seat of which was in Stanton, right outside the museum's walls there. And notice the color of his uniform. The county lieutenant's commissions mirrored that of the military specifications of the governor's commission and letter of instruction. He was the commander-in-chief of the county's militia. Again, he could command, levy, muster, raise troops from anywhere in the county, march them anywhere in the county. He could cross county boundaries if a neighboring county asked for assistance. He made sure the militia was provided with arms and ammunition and trained, was exercised, maintained good order and discipline. And when you established a new county, they would usually establish the companies of the county. County's militia was usually divided into 10 companies regionally. They didn't all have to have the same people. They weren't organized tactically. They were organized as an administrative unit. So if they needed soldiers to go on expedition, they would call a muster. They would first ask for volunteers. If they didn't get enough volunteers, then they would start drafting people to fill the requirements of the unit they needed to raise for an expedition or some other active military service. Let's talk about the Virginia colonies militia law. I give some talks to folks, and a lot of times people in the audience will say, well, my great whatever joined the militia in 17 whatever it was. Well, in this era that we're talking about now, the colonial period, before the Revolutionary War starts, you didn't join the militia. When you turned 18, you were in the militia. Okay? It was a civil requirement for every able-bodied white male citizen, aged 18 to 60. And it was said that they were enlisted, or not enlisted, but listed or enrolled. But they were in. The requirement was for these adult able-bodied males to have a firelock, a weapon, either a musket or a fowling piece. If they lived in the Tidewater or other places, if they lived in the mountains, they could substitute a rifle instead, since that weapon was more available in the mountain areas. They also had to have a bayonet. Well, as some of you that are interested in military history know, the rifle cannot accept a bayonet, but you needed something for that close-in fight. So if you were armed with a rifle, you could substitute a tomahawk. You were required to have a cartridge box, but if you had a rifle, or if you didn't have a cartridge box, you could substitute the shot pouch and the powder horn for your ammunition. You also had to have a certain amount of lead and powder at your home, and you had to show up with some of it at every training assembly or muster that they would have from time to time. Some people were exempt from assembling with arms with a militia, such as Quakers, people that held certain government jobs, but they were still considered part of the militia. And if it came to drafting somebody, if it was one of these folks, particularly Quakers, they had to put up some money to be able to arm a substitute and hire a substitute to take their place. So they weren't off the hook just because they were pacifists. Some officials, same thing. They might have been exempt from drilling, but they had to put up some money because some soldiers, some members of the militia were not rich enough to own a firelock and a cartridge box and a bayonet and the powder and the lead. So the officials that were members of the militia but were exempt from drilling put up the money to arm and equip the poor men in the militia. When they got too old to be in the militia, or they died or something, the widow would turn the weapon and the equipment back into the company commander, who would put it back into the local armory so it could be issued to another poor man. Now, militia training. Companies held what were called private musters, the captain would call them. They mustered 4 times a year, at least, more often during wartime, or if the captain thought necessary. And the entire county, under the county lieutenant, would have a general muster at least once a year, more in wartime, or if the colonel thought it was necessary. And they would go through training. They didn't get paid for going to weekend drills like a National Guardsman or a reservist does today. They only got paid if they were called out on an alarm into actual service for a minimum of a week. That's when they started to get paid. And then they would train. Now, the militia in the Tidewater would mostly train in the 1764 British manual exercise, what the British Army trained in. Those in the mountains would also do that. But they would also more often in the mountains be practicing light infantry tactics. That was perfected during the French and Indian War. And it's not fighting Indian style. I want to get that clear. The British had a doctrine for fighting irregulars in broken country. So they took that and had adapted it to the American woods. Yes, taking some tactics or techniques they learned from either Indian allies or from fighting Indian enemies, put it all together. And what the result was something they called bush fighting or skirmishing. So this was fighting in the woods, not the linear tactics that you're familiar with from the movies about the Revolutionary War. Also, when fighting Indians, they would do something called the strategic offense and the tactical defense. The way you could defeat Indians was by marching into their territory, using your light forces, your riflemen, light infantry, to develop a situation and get the Indians to attack you. Where was the strength of the militia? It was in cohesive units firing volleys of musketry. So we'd get the Indians to attack you that way. So marching into their territory, strategic offense, and then making the Indians attack you, preferably behind fortifications, the tactical defense. Now, the militia had some specialized type, we would call them specialized type units. They weren't called that then. You had the Rangers. Now, if you've seen the movie Northwest Passage with Spencer Tracy, or any movie that talks about Rogers Rangers, we're not talking anything like this. They weren't like those kind of Rangers. The term Ranger comes from they would go out on patrols and they would range down this river and then range across that mountain and range back to this fort. And that's where they get the term Ranger. And their main job was frontier defense, either to detect and intercept enemy war parties, or to pursue a war party that's already struck out of the area, or to reinforce the local militia. Their job is if they found a war party, they'd go back to the community, warn the local militia captain that his community was in danger of being attacked, so he could muster his troops to defend the community. Scouts are similar. They worked in groups like 4 or 5. And did the same thing. They would go out near the local community and they would look for what were called Indian signs, a campfire that was still kind of warm to the touch and big enough to accommodate a war party of 10 or 15 warriors or something like that. Same thing. Go back, warn the local commander of the militia that his community was in danger so he could muster the troops. And then spies. Spies, don't think 007. These guys, maybe singly or in small groups, maybe 2, 3, that would find a mountain somewhere where they could look down onto an Indian town. And if the Indians in the town were holding a war dance, it was a pretty good indication that they were getting ready to go on the warpath, so they could go back to the community and again warn the local militia that there was danger approaching. Let's talk about some of the things that were happening leading up to the war. In 1772, the British Army pretty much withdraws its regulars from just about all its posts along the Ohio and Mississippi. Very few of them left. One of the ones withdrawn, of course, is the one at Fort Pitt. Fort Pitt falls into disrepair. 1773, Daniel Boone and William Russell tried to lead a group of settlers to establish a settlement in what's now Kentucky. They get one group of them gets ambushed, and both Boone's and Russell's sons are among the people killed, and so they go back to Virginia. Interestingly enough, when the news hits the Virginia papers, it's the same time that the Virginia papers have the story of the Boston Tea Party. At the same time, Virginia and Pennsylvania are engaged in a boundary dispute over the forks of the Ohio. If you want to know more about that, you can ask me in the Q&A. But both colonies claim that area. And initially, Virginia is going to get the upper hand when Lord Dunmore commissions John Connolly as a captain of militia to establish a militia in that area, a Virginia militia in that area. Also appoints him as a chief magistrate or justice of the peace. To get sworn in as a justice of the peace, he has to travel to to Stanton to get sworn in by Charles Lewis, who is also the chief magistrate of the county. And Pittsburgh is established as a district of Augusta County, Virginia. Surveyors, of course, are looking for places to establish patents that veterans of the French and Indian War have been awarded or that people have purchased to mark off property. And some of these surveyors start to get harassed in 1773 and early 1774. And a couple times there are some raids when an Indian hunting party might cross to the south bank of the Ohio and have an unfortunate run-in with some settlers or with a group of hunters from a settlement, and there's an exchange of violence. So things kind of creep closer and closer to war. The ones that are most potentially going to be doing this, sometimes Cherokee, but mostly the Shawnees. The Shawnees are the ones that are itching for a fight, and the Shawnees eventually close river traffic. I'm sorry I don't have a pointer, but this is the area of Dunmore's War that we're talking about. So if you look in the upper right, kind of to the left of where it says Westmoreland, we're talking about the area of the Forks of the Ohio, Pittsburgh. Then if you follow the Ohio River down, you can see some of the other communities along. Wheeling is there, where Wheeling, West Virginia is now. If you follow the river down, Fort Gower, that's at the mouth of the Hockhocking River, across the Ohio River from the Little Kanawha River. If you follow it down even further, you see where it says Battle of Point Pleasant. That is Point Pleasant, where the Big Kanawha, the Great Kanawha, empties out into the Ohio, just to give you an idea of the territory. And then some of the counties we're going to be talking about mostly are Baditat, Augusta, and Fincastle, and you can see them on the map. But we're not going to neglect Frederick and Hampshire counties either that are farther north on the map. Now, as things get closer and closer to violence breaking out, John Connolly notifies the local commanders of the militia in the Western District of Augusta County. They call it the incendiary article. And why this incendiary circular? What this means is he says that it looks like any kind of negotiations with the Indians is breaking down and war is inevitable, and that the Shawnees are ill disposed. And he tells the local militia commanders to be on their guard. Now, in Wheeling, there's a group of surveyors and hunters that elect Michael Cressup as their leader. They are not yet embodied as militia, but the local community gets them to help defend their community. And there's an exchange of violence there as well. But the big thing that happens, it happens on Yellow Creek or Baker's Bottom. Yellow Creek is on the north bank of the Ohio, where Yellow Creek empties into the Ohio. Directly across the river from it is Baker's Bottom. And there's a family named Baker that runs a trading post there. Now, all this is going on, and two brothers named Greathouse, the leader being Daniel Greathouse, gets a bright idea. He's going to invite Indians from over at Yellow Creek over to Baker's Bottom get them drunk, have a shooting contest or something like that. Now, the problem is the village at the mouth of Yellow Creek are Mingo. Mingo are part of the Six Nations. The Mingo are not only friendly, they are British allies. But some people, they don't care whether the Indians are friend or foe. They don't like them either way. So they invite some of these Mingo over to Baker's Bottom, get them drunk, and murder them, some men, women, and children. And as soon as they do this group of ruffians, not embodied as militia, realize right away that they have probably just started an Indian war, and they leave, and they're going to leave their neighbors who are unaware that this has happened to any violence that results. When he comes home, one of the Indian leading warriors on the Mingo side, known to the white people as Logan, finds out that not only has some of his people been murdered by the Greathouse gang, but it included his sister, her unborn baby, and his brother or other close relatives, and he swears revenge. He puts together a group war party 40 Bingo warriors. They cross to the south bank of the Ohio and they start attacking settlements. The image you see on the lower right is attack on the Spicer farm. Logan and his warriors attack the farm. They kill the parents. Some of the adolescent sons, a few, I think, escape to go get the militia to help. You can see, if you can see the picture, there's a little boy, little girl running away from the cabin. That's Betsy and little Will Spicer. They will be captured by Logan and taken prisoner. If I forget to mention it, ask what happened to the Spicer kids when we get to the end of the war and are taken back to the Indian town. The Shawnees, like I said, already itching for a fight. They join the Mingo. In fact, they bring in all their warriors to enlarge the war. And soon Shawnee war parties are crossing to the south bank as well to raid settlements and farms. A lot of settlers flee the frontier. The government wants them to stay. So a lot of settlers do what was called forting up. Forting up, if you're familiar with like Paquette's Fort down in, was it Claremont, West Virginia? I think is the name of the town. Fairmont, West Virginia. You can tell the difference between a military installation and a private fort. A military installation, fort comes first, like Fort Williams. If it's a hardened family farm or a private fort, it would be the other way around. Williams Fort would be one of these. So regardless of either one, the men would go there, bring in their families, their domesticated animals, take shelter in the fort. Everybody's in the militia, so they're going to pull some kind of militia duty. Some of the militiamen are on full-time duty called constant guards. Others are, militiamen when there's an emergency. When they're forted up, these militiamen go out into the fields, and say there are 20 of them. On Monday, they all go to Farmer Jones's field. Half of them stand guard, the other half work the field. They go back into the fort at night. On Tuesday, they go to Farmer Smith's field. Half of them stand guard, the other half work the field. You get the picture. So the crops don't rot in the field, and they continue to work their farms while defending themselves and their families. So you get the idea of forting up. Now the Shawnees are going to take over the fight. Their commander, their war chief, war leader, a man named Cornstalk. That's what the white people call them. Logan also with bringing the Mingos, and they look for allies among the Wyandots, the Miamis, the Delawares, the Cherokees, and Six Nations as well. And you really see Indian national interests come out here. The Six Nations, the Iroquois, are British allies. They hold a conference with Sir William Johnson up at his baronial manor in the Mohawk Valley, Johnson Hall, and they pretty much tell those Indian nations under their dominion, do not help the Shawnees. If you do, you're going to answer to us militarily, economically, diplomatically. Yes, that doesn't mean that some individual Cherokees or some individual Delawares will go join Cornstalk's war parties, but for the most part, those nations stay out of the war, and it pretty much isolates the Shawnees and those Mingos that are with them. Dunmore has to enter the picture because you have 3 or more counties on the frontier that are really having problems with the Indians. And he makes the announcement that pacification can no longer be entertained. It's obvious that they're going to go to war. So he has to coordinate the efforts between all the counties on the frontier, encourage the settlers to stay, to encourage the militia to not only defend their communities, but assist their neighboring communities and to build fortifications. And he looks to, Fort Pitt is renamed Fort Dunmore and put back in good shape. The fort at Wheeling is called Fort Fincastle. Fincastle is another one of Dunmore's titles. So you're starting to see a pattern here. He recommends that another fort be established at Point Pleasant. It's going to be called Fort Blair, another one of Lord Dunmore's titles. So the guy at least had an ego. Also calling out militiamen to be constant guards. Those are full-time militiamen, as well as full-time soldiers to be in those ranger companies we talked about, and scouts, and to launch a limited incursion into Shawnee territory. It's led by a Major Angus MacDonald. They raid a town called Wakatamaika. on the Muskingum River. Doesn't do much, doesn't change the military situation at all. The war continues. So there's going to have to be something else that's done. So Dunmore contacts the county lieutenants of the frontier counties and say, we're going to have to take the offensive. Now, why would you take the offensive? It's important to take the fight to the enemy. It's also less expensive. It's more effective. You can't stay on the defensive and be equally strong everywhere all the time at the same time. You can more likely put an end to the war if you take the offensive. And what one of the objectives is to break the military confederacy, the military power of the confederacy that the Shawnees are trying to put together. He's going to establish an army that has two wings to it, a northern or right wing starting from the north and a southern or left wing starting from the south. The initial plan is for them to converge and attack the principal town of the Shawnees at Chillicothe on the Scioto River. These plans somewhat get changed and modified, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But they're going to use that strategic offense, tactical defense as much as they can. Dunmore wants to raise some regiments of provincial regulars. You might have read somewhere that the House of Burgesses didn't want to support Dunmore's war. Well, that's not entirely true. They didn't want to pay for raising regulars because they're more expensive. You have to pay them as soon as they enlist. You have to pay them until they're discharged. So the Speaker of the House of Burgesses, Peyton Randolph, tells Lord Dunmore that you have the authority to call the militia out instead of raising regulars. And the beauty of that for the House of Burgesses, you can pay them in arrears, not up front like you would the regulars. These are the two wings of Dunmore's army. One's going to descend the Ohio. The titular commander is Colonel Adam Stephen. He was second in command of the Virginia Regiment under George Washington during the French and Indian War. He is the county lieutenant of, I think it's Berkshire County at the time. Dunmore wants him to raise 1,200 men from the counties you see there, Frederick, Dunmore, Berkeley, and Hampshire counties, and from the Western District of Augusta. And they will assemble at both Winchester and Fort Pitt before they move against the Indians. The other is going to work from the other direction. Mostly troops from Augusta, Botetourt, and Fincastle counties, some from Bedford, Dunmore, and Culpeper. They're going to muster at Camp Union. Camp Union is where Lewisburg, West Virginia is now. 1,300 men is what he wants them to raise. They'll be under the command of Colonel Andrew Lewis. Andrew Lewis was the county lieutenant of Botetourt County at the time. He was a major in the Virginia Regiment under Washington during the French and Indian War. So you can see these guys have quite a military background as it is. Problem with Stephen, though, unfortunately, it's kind of like Grant traveling with Meade during the Civil War, where who's actually running the Army of the Potomac? Is it the General in Chief Grant, or is it the commander or the supposed commander of the Army of the Potomac? They assemble the troops and their supplies in the two different places that mentioned, actually three different places. Camp Union, the troops assemble, they gather their supplies, they get their pack animals together, and so forth. They also train and rehearse the actions they're going to have to perform. These guys just didn't pick up a musket and go out to fight. They did look into training. Up in the northern part of that army that's under Stephen and Dunmore assemble at Winchester, some at Pittsburgh. The ones from Winchester start to march north. Some of them will turn east under William Crawford, 500 of them with the pack horses and the cattle. The rest will continue to Pittsburgh, where they'll join other forces assembling around Pittsburgh, and then they'll take the watercraft and head down the Ohio by boat. Again, we've already seen that. As they march into Indian Territory, what you see in the middle is a diagram of how the army in the southern wing was advancing. If you're familiar with Pontiac's War, this is a lot like the march into Indian Territory that was conducted by Bouquet in 1765 against the Shawnee as well. In the middle of the formation is where you have your cattle. To the either side of those, the pack horses. To either side of those, the main two columns of marching militia infantry. And then outside of those, you have additional soldiers acting as flank security and front security and rear security. So no matter what direction the Indians try to attack you from when you're marching, you can deploy into line of battle and protect your supplies while you're doing it. And this is how they're going to get from where they were to where they need to go. It's called the protected advance. As they march, they establish supply magazines along the way. Those marching with Andrew Lewis, and that's who we're going to concentrate on for this because it deals mostly with the troops that are from the Stanton area. They're going to establish a magazine, a supply base, fortified at the mouth of Elk River, where Charleston, West Virginia is now. They'll build that supply magazine. They'll also build a number of canoes and other watercraft. So they don't have enough pack animals to carry all the supplies they need to carry. So the pack animals are running back and forth from Camp Union to the mouth of the Elk as they're getting ready. As the troops march, the troops from Augusta County march first, and they are followed a few days later by the ones from Botetourt County. And then the ones from Fincastle County will be several days behind them with the last of the pack animals and the cattle as they march. Once the first two units, Augusta and Botetourt, reach the Elk, they build the magazine, they build the canoes, the men and pack animals that are with them and cattle start to march along the north bank of the Kanawha towards Point Pleasant while they move their supplies and equipment by boat down the Kanawha, keeping pace with each other. And they get to Point Pleasant around the 6th of October, 1774. If you know your history, at the same time, the First Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia at the same time. When the first elements of Andrew Lewis's army gets to Point Pleasant, his scouts report seeing Indians. They think they're a hunting party. Nothing to be worried about, sir. So they establish their camp. They put up their pens for their animals, their pack horses, and their cattle. They establish their tents. The Botetourt line is erecting their tents along the Ohio, whereas the Augusta line is erecting their tents along the Kanawha, and they start to make fortification just in case, for security purposes, in case they get attacked for some reason. Now, when they get to Point Pleasant, some of the cattle are starting to wear out. So Colonel Andrew Lewis gives the word that he wants to slaughter the weaker cattle first. This doesn't go over quite well with some of the company commanders. Now, with the Botetourt County contingent are two companies from Fincastle County, Captain Evan Shelby and Captain William Russell. So one morning on the 10th, actually, the 10th of October, each of those companies sends out two hunters, and they're going to go out to find deer to bring back some venison to supplement the men's rations with. So they go out before reveille is sounded, but the troops aren't really moving yet. They're not under arms. Some of them are cooking their breakfast while these two groups of two hunters each goes out into the point to go hunting. Now, if you look up towards the middle of the map, you'll see a label that says Cornstalk's Camp. While Lewis's men were encamping on the 6th of October, Cornstalk was leading about 800 warriors down to this area. And on the night of the 9th, they rig up rafts, cross the Ohio River, and set up their camp in an old abandoned Indian town. And the name of the creek is still called Old Town Creek, but that's what they're going to set up. Now, why did they do this? Okay, remember the troop strength that I showed you before. The right wing of Dunmore's army is going to be descending down the Ohio to the mouth of the Hockhocking with 1,200 troops. Andrew Lewis's southern wing of the army is going up the Kanawha to the Ohio with 1,300 troops. So 2,500 soldiers moving towards Chillicothe. Cornstalk knows that the only way he can defeat Dunmore's army is what in military terms is called defeating them in detail, defeating one wing of the army and then turning around to defeat the other. He decides he's going to attack Andrew Lewis's wing of the army first, down at Point Pleasant. Doesn't necessarily have to destroy them, but hit them hard enough to demoralize them, maybe make them retreat or decide not to go any further, not to cross the Ohio, and then he can turn around and deal with the wing that's under Dunmore. That's his plan. So they're going to attack very early in the morning. Like I said, reveille has sounded, but the troops in the camp are not yet ready. At the same time, the two groups, 2 hunters each, are out hunting. One of the two hunters steps into a clearing and realizes that there are a number of Indian warriors sleeping in the clearing. One of them later said you cannot cross the clearing without stepping on a warrior. Some of the warriors wake up, start shooting at the hunters. Luckily, neither of them is hit. They run back to the camp. They're yelling the password as they go by the sentries, and they run to the officer of the guard to report what has happened. And the alarm drums start beating, and the men start getting under arms, so the camp has been roused. The other team of hunters is moving along and run into some Indian warriors. The Indians fire first. One of the hunters is killed. The other one does make it back to the camp. Now, Colonel Andrew Lewis hears the commotion, goes to the officer of the guard's tent to find out what's going on. And the officer of the guard, his name is John Stewart, tells him, sir, these hunters have seen some Indians out there. They think maybe they're a scouting party, a big scouting party, but nonetheless a scouting party. So it's probably where Andrew Lewis makes the biggest mistake of his military career. He tells his brother, Charles Lewis, the colonel, commander of the Augusta County line, assemble 150 of your men, the first ones that can be ready immediately with a proper number of officers, and go out on our right flank and see what's in front of us. And he turns to Colonel William Fleming, his deputy county lieutenant for Botetourt County, in charge of the Botetourt line, to do the same. And they're going to go on the left flank of the Virginia Army following the Ohio River. So they deploy out and they start moving forward on Point Pleasant. And they go about a mile, maybe a little bit further, where in Charles Lewis's column is following along what's called Crooked Creek. You can see the creek there on the right-hand side of where all the markings are. And as they step out into a cleared area, Indians open fire on them. Lewis is mortally wounded by one of the first shots. Still alive for the time being, though, he orders his men to deploy into battle formation, into a line of battle. And they try to do this so they can repel the Indian attack. At the same time, the Indians are trying to get around their flanks to attack them on both sides, and he has to try to prevent them from succeeding at that. Almost at the same time, Colonel Fleming's column is moving along the Ohio, and they are taken under fire by Indian War Party. Colonel Fleming takes 3 bullets. He is critically wounded, but he will survive. Both the colonels are helped back to the camp as captains take over the battle, and they try to get both wings of the army, both wings that are out in front of the camp, to try to make one line across the point to try to stop the Indians' advance. And they're retreating at the time. The Virginians are retreating at the time. They're giving ground because that's the only thing they can do, not to become surrounded. And as they're retreating back towards the camp, the men in the camp can see that the battle is going on, and battle right now is not going well. So Andrew Lewis has to call on a Colonel John Field. A colonel was his permanent rank. He was the county lieutenant of Culpeper County. But he only raised 3 companies of volunteers to go on this expedition. So as far as the expedition is concerned, he's getting the pay of a major. But Colonel Lewis sees that both his brother and Colonel Fleming are down. He needs a competent field officer. He restores Colonel Field to his colonel rank and sends him forward to the battle with about 250 reinforcements to try to plug the gap between the 2 columns that went out looking for the Indians earlier and to take over the battle. Well, the battle line finally is joined together, and they pretty much stop the Indian advance. It goes no further, but it dissolves down into a firefight with the Indians and the militiamen trading fire for a good couple hours. In the course of that, Colonel Field is killed. So now we have three colonels down. But the captains rise to the occasion. Captain Evan Shelby, the two Fincastle County companies that accompanied the Body Tut line, Russell and Evan Shelby's are also in there. Evan Shelby takes over the battle. He is the most competent. He is the most experienced of the captains and takes over the fight from there. The fight continues along for most of the rest of the day. Now, Lewis knows, that's Andrew Lewis, knows that Colonel Christian, William Christian, is following with the rest of the Fincastle County contingent along the Kanawha River, coming with the pack horses and the rest of the cattle. He sends word back to him, to Christian, leave a small guard in charge of the cattle and pack horses and come with as many men as you can because we're under attack. And Christian responds. Christian and his Fincastle men are on the way. About the same time, late in the afternoon. This is not the kind of fight the Indians had wanted. They wanted to get it over with quickly, but they now on a slugfest with the Virginians. And they know that Dunmore is ready to move against Chillicothe. So Cornstalk gives the order to start pulling back. And the Virginians start seeing Indian warriors carrying their dead and wounded off the field, hiding the bodies of the dead and carrying the wounded to the Old Town Creek and giving ground. The Virginians follow. The Virginians get to that place where you can see where it says woodland, where there's some high ground on the right-hand side of the point there. The Indians take position there. The Virginians know it's not a very good idea to make a frontal assault on that wooded hillside. So they maintain the pressure on the Indians as the Indians are taking away their wounded. Finally, the rest of the Indians withdraw to where it says Cornstalk's camp. They recover their rafts, cross back over to the north bank of the Ohio, and the battle is ending as William Christian and the Fincastle County contingent arrives at the point. So in the course of the battle, each side had about 800 combatants actually in the fight at the same time. When Christian's men get there, of course, the Virginians will have more. But the battle is pretty evenly meshed as far as it goes. Now, Andrew Lewis has to notify Dunmore that he's been in a fight. It's going to take him some days to bring up the cattle to cross the Ohio to where he can join them on the Pickaway Plains near Chillicothe. He has to take care of his dead and wounded, and that he's going to be gone a few days before they make their way to join the rest of the army on the Pickaway Plains. The right wing, the one under Dunmore and Stephen, advance along the Hockhocking River to the Pickaway Plains. When they get there, they establish Camp Charlotte, a fortified camp, and they are ready to start sending patrols or whatever against Chillicothe, where the main Indian town is. As Cornstalk and his warriors are retreating, they realize they are in the unenviable position of having Dunmore having advanced while they were busy fighting Lewis. And now they're at a real disadvantage. They get back to Chillicothe. Cornstalk calls his chiefs together and say, okay, men, we have one of two choices to make. We can either kill our women and children ourselves, destroy our town, and then attack Dunmore in his camp. And we know we're going to die doing that because we're in a very bad position. Or I can go talk to Lord Dunmore and see what kind of peace terms we can get. And he takes the second option. Cornstalk goes to Camp Charlotte to talk to Dunmore. They start talking what terms we're going to settle on for peace. And the peace terms that Dunmore offers them are remarkably lenient. The Virginians demand no cession of Shawnee territory on the north bank of the Ohio, asks only that the Shawnees and those Mingos with them respect the boundary of the Ohio River that was settled at the 1768 Treaty of Fort Stanwix. They demand, one of the only demands they make, is that the warriors return any prisoners they have taken in raids on the south bank of the Ohio. This includes Betsy and Will Spicer. By the way, Betsy will be repatriated. Will decides he wants to stay with, he's been adopted into an Indian family, and he decides he'd rather stay with his Indian family. The Indians have to return any horses they took in the raids on the south bank of the Ohio. They have to open commerce again and not harass any traders making their way up or down the Ohio. And they have to look at Virginia instead of Pennsylvania, as they had been doing, as we would say it was the most favored trading nation. Okay, they would primarily trade with Virginia colony traders instead of Pennsylvania traders. And the only other one that seems a bit harsh as part of the treaty terms are the Shawnees have to give up 6 hostages, chiefs or sons of chiefs. Now, to us, that sounds harsh because we have a different concept of what they mean by hostages. In this era, in order, when the Indians were on a losing side of a battle, in order not to say they want peace, in order to extricate themselves from a losing battle, the other side would demand hostages that would meet them at a certain time for the formal treaty. All this is here, Camp Charlotte, is an armistice. It's not the peace treaty. The peace treaty will happen at Fort Pitt or Fort Dunmore in March to make sure the headmen of the Shawnees make it. That's why the 6 hostages have to be there. And if you've read the memoir of Nicholas Creswell, he talks about seeing the 6 hostages come through Winchester later. They're not prisoners. They're not under guard. They're not shackled. They're traveling by themselves. They're considered honorable men. They're not thrown in the public jail at Williamsburg. They're allowed the freedom of the town, and they know on their honor that they will stay there until it's time for the treaty to convene in March. So this pretty much ends the war itself, and the militia are starting to be released back to go down to their home communities. Some will stay on the frontier for a little while. What happened to Logan? Well, Logan doesn't want to surrender. He takes off with some of his warriors. Dunmore sends William Crawford with some troops to track him down, which they do. And they corner him. And in the course of talking to him, John Gibson, who was the father of Logan's sister's child that survived the massacre that we talked about earlier, conducts the negotiation. And if you look at Thomas Jefferson's notes on the current state of Virginia, he writes about something called Logan's Lament. This is supposed to be a representation of Indian eloquence. And it starts out like, when did a white man ever come to Logan's lodge? And if he was hungry, Logan did not give him something to eat. Or if he was thirsty, Logan did not provide him with something to drink. And it kind of reads like the Gospel of Matthew, but it's touted as eloquence of American Indians. Logan gives up the fight at that point, and the war is definitely over. And the Virginia soldiers are heading back home, or at least to the banks of the Ohio. Dunmore, this happens in November. Dunmore makes his way back to his capital at Williamsburg and gets there right before Christmas. He is toasted. He's at the height of his popularity. There are balls thrown in his honor and other celebrations. The papers run votes of thanks from the professors of the College of William and Mary and from the city councils at Williamsburg and Norfolk and so forth. And then I like to say he got to his office and he opened up his email. So he starts opening the letters that have been piling up on his desk since he's been out on the frontier. He left for the frontier in July. It is now December. And he's getting letters from the Secretary of State for the colonies, pretty much saying, Dunmore, where the heck have you been? Have you heard about this General Congress that they held, the Americans have held in Philadelphia? Do you know if any people from your colony went? What is going on down there, pretty much? And, being handed his lunch. Of course, I'm simplifying it, but he's pretty much being castigated for being out on the frontier fighting an Indian war when things are happening back in the colonies. This starts Dunmore's slip into villainy. Okay, he's at the height of his personality, height of his popularity, but by April, we have the gunpowder plot, where the colonies are starting to get more and more belligerent against the British government. He reconvenes the General Assembly in June, but he doesn't stay around long. He moves his capital to HMS Fowey, a British warship in the York River, or the James River, rather. And pretty much from then on, for the next year or so, he is trying to maintain royal authority, but fighting a losing battle doing it, as the Revolutionary War grows deeper and deeper. And that brings us to the end of Lord Dunmore's war. He remains, at least by name, the royal governor of Virginia until the end of the Revolutionary War. He is nearby, offshore, of course, when Cornwallis surrenders the British army. That was around Yorktown, and that pretty much ends his ability to reestablish his governorship of Virginia. Later, he will be the royal governor of Jamaica. But basically, his time in America is over. So, unless you have any questions, this ends my presentation on Lord Dunmore's War, the last Indian conflict of America's colonial era. Thank you.